Hi guys, welcome back. So today we're talking about the value of family. All of us have family here, we all have children here. But what is the value of family?
It's recognizing that the church itself is a family. It's one of the most common descriptions of it in the Bible. The people of God are a family, that God is Father, that we're adopted into his family, that we're sons and daughters of his, and we relate to each other as brother and sister. That should be the primary relationship in the church, is brother to sister, or sister to sister, brother to brother.
Yeah, when we talk about family, we really don't mean the 4 and the dog, or 4.2 or whatever the number is these days. It's actually the you think about all our families, they're incredibly diverse. I've got relatives all over the world. I've got people of every age in my family, and church needs to be like that.
Yeah. So what's the biblical basis behind family?
It's the 1 Corinthians 12, which is the one body, many parts idea, that actually it's not just about, we accept that we have many generations. No, it works at its best when it is multi-generational, multi-gifted, skilled, many backgrounds coming together. All that stuff comes together to make this body function.
Galatians 3 talks about there's no Greek or barbarian, there's no slave and free, but we're all one in Christ. We're all children of God. And so it's not to say that those distinctions don't exist. It's saying that with regards to salvation, everyone's equal and we're all brought together as children of God. And so it's not to go, well, actually, then we should all aspire to be white middle class, and if you don't conform to that, then let's go to that, because that's who the elders are, or I'm calling myself middle class, it's probably a stretch. But that sort of idea of this is what a church person looks like, that's not what that's saying. It's not saying get rid of all of your flavour. It's saying before God we're all equal, we're all children of God, and then we should each individually bring our cultural backgrounds, our family upbringings, all of those sorts of things to bring variety, and we want to enjoy those things. So we want to make a big deal. Really, every week we want to make a big deal, but we take time once a year at least to say we're going to celebrate all of the diversity that God's blessed us with culturally. Because I think it's important to do that.
It all sounds wonderful, and you've given a little glimpse here and there, but what's the vision behind the value of family?
If you say what does a good family look like, a good family looks like one that supports each other and supports one another. But also we believe that actually to fulfill what God's called us to as a church in Watford requires everyone to play a role. It means that we've all got to look after each other. And when people are down or struggling, we do our best to support that individual and pick them up, and on the basis that when they're up they can do the same for others. It's kind of, in very practical terms, bringing meals around when people are unwell. That's the sort of example of the sort of thing that church does. Financially supporting people who have come upon hard times, that's kind of, the biblical model of church was like that. We talked about that in other values. So
I think it's important what Andy said about what does a good family look like, because I think words like seeing God as Father or saying we've got a value of family can be quite loaded terms for people. So if your family wasn't very good, you think, good grief, I hope church isn't like a family. So it's important to say, well, what does a good family look like? And that's what we're saying. We're saying church should be like a good family. And so I think in a good family, you're known, your relatives know who you are, you're loved, you're looked after, you're sort of given space to grow and develop and fulfill your potential. If you look around sort of various statistics, loneliness is a massive issue at the moment. In the UK and in Watford as well, I think lots of people, as they get older, they've got no connections perhaps with their own family, or that those have become strained. And so this idea of loneliness being sort of countered by family, I think is something that we see the church being able to be an antidote to that in society, and saying there is a place for you to belong, there's a place where you can be known, a place where you can be loved, and a place where you can find space to express who you are in a right way.
And in Ephesians 4, we did a series on it not so long ago. It's got this thing about make every effort to maintain the bonds of peace. Well, the clues in that word, make every effort, it means that to be a good functioning family requires the Holy Spirit to help us in many ways to kind of deal with the fact that there is disagreement in families. A good family isn't one that just no one ever falls out or no one ever has a disagreement, especially if the idea is you want to bring together generations and cultures.
Yeah.
And you push that all together, you've got a kind of volatile mix for disagreement.
Yeah.
But in a poor family, that disagreement causes fracture and people don't talk to each other and they blank each other. That's what happens in a poor family. You want to be a good family, then we need to obviously make every effort to maintain the bonds of peace. If I can be forgiven for everything I've ever done, every sin I ever committed, in thought, in word, in deed, in my past, in my present, in my future, if I can be forgiven by that from God, how could I take offence at you that you said something that was a little bit cutting once? I mean, that's just not mirroring God at all.
I think that takes practice as well. I mean, even like I've got my two girls, I have to teach them how to do that. You have to say, well, no, you need to make allowances for your sister. And I think that works itself out in a church setting where, you know, we want to reflect the cultures that are in our church. So that might mean that we're going to sing songs that aren't quite to your taste in style, or we're going to do things in a way that isn't quite what you would like, but actually we're doing it for the benefit of other people and for sort of to accommodate the other in a positive way, not just in a...
Yeah, I think that pretty much sums up the previous values of being centered around love.
Yeah.
And I think it's great that you guys addressed the relational ruptures, the reality of how family can be. So thank you so much for sharing on the value of family, and next week we'll look at another value. Thank you.
Don't tell a story, you need your hands, don't you? Anyway, the bad news is I don't claim to be a great storyteller, but the art of storytelling we've lost in our culture, haven't we? We tell the stories to our children late at night, but it's normally somebody else's stories and our grandchildren. But we have lost the art of storytelling. And when we think back to the Middle East and when we think back to the time of Jesus, Jesus didn't preach very often as we normally understand preaching, but Jesus told loads and loads of stories. So I want to try and bring back the art of storytelling, and that's one reason why I'm going to tell a story today. But the good news is, I'm going to tell you one of the very best stories that has ever been told or written, so that can't be bad. And the other good thing is, you know it already. Or you think you do. Okay, but the other thing is, you can't tell a story standing up. You need to sit down to tell a story. So, excuse me just a moment. Are you sitting comfortably? Yes. There I'll begin. This is a story about a family. A very, very wealthy family that lived about 2,000 years ago in the Middle East. A story, it was wealthy. It was they owned a lot of land, they had a lot of animals. They lived in a sort of a courtyard in the middle of this village. And the head of the family was, of course, the father. And he was a man of position. He was a man of status. He was a pillar of society. He always walked like this. Sort of Prince Charles had his back, you know. He walked like this. He was an important man. Everybody looked up to him. When they passed him, they would greet him. And he was a very special man with a very high reputation and a high status. And he was married to a lady who was also well regarded in the society, and she had a lot of friends, and they came together and she did things. And they had two boys. The eldest boy was not really a very social creature. He kept himself to himself. He liked his own company. He didn't really mix with people. He would spend time on his own a lot, and they didn't see an awful lot of him. He was a bit difficult. But the younger son, who was probably about 17, 18, the younger son, he was different altogether. He was a party boy. He was a party boy. He was the life and soul of the party, in fact. Whenever anything was going on, and anything was happening, particularly with the younger people, he was there. And he was really a bit irresponsible. Never did his homework. No, he was pretty irresponsible. And then there were daughters in the family. 2 or 3 daughters. I'm not quite sure how many daughters, but there would have been daughters in the family. And then there were servants. Probably 2 or 3 families of servants in the family. They had been servants of this family for a long time. They did the cooking and they did the cleaning and they looked after the farm and the estate. They managed everything. They did very well, and they were liked and they were looked after. I mean, some of you watched Downton Abbey and you know what the servants were like in that situation. They were part of the family, really, weren't they? They were appreciated and they were loved, but they didn't wear shoes. In those situations, if you were a servant, you didn't wear shoes. It was part of the hierarchy. And then also, there were hired men. Now, these were men who lived in the village, sometimes in accommodation and sometimes, I guess, just on the street. But they were men who every morning would go to the centre of the village and they would be hired for the day. All right? They'd be hired for the day. And sometimes they'd get hired for the day, and sometimes they wouldn't get hired for the day. And then at the end of the day, they would be paid off. And they would hope that the same thing happened the next day. And this family that we're talking about, they used to go, or rather one of the servants used to go, down to the middle of the village each morning to hire the number of people they wanted. And sometimes they wanted 5 people for the day, and sometimes 10, and if it was harvest, they probably wanted 15 or 20. They hired the people they needed for that day. But one thing about those hired men, they had no security of status. They had no security at all, but they did have lunch. When they were hired for the day, they got lunch. All right? So that's the sort of family we've got. And we're talking about a shame on a culture. So the way people think about you is very, very important. Your honor, your status within the family is just so, so, so important. Particularly for the father, but the father's status affected the whole family. You had to be seen to be well respected in the society. Then one day, the worst possible thing happened. The younger son, I don't know what provoked it, nobody knows what provoked it, but he storms into his father's presence and he says, "Dad, I want my inheritance now." Now that was horrendous. The inheritance of a father was distributed on his death. And in this case, the elder son would get 2/3 and the younger son would get 1/3. Daughter's nothing at all, of course, but anyway. Okay? So this guy was basically saying to his dad, "Dad, I wish you were dead. I wish you had died yesterday so that I could have my inheritance today. I wish you were dead." In other words, he was being the most insulting to his dad that he could possibly. He was totally breaking the relationship. And of course, in that situation, you don't do that in private. Everybody knows. You know, the servants knew what was happening, and they probably tried to keep it quiet for a little while, but it got out, and everybody knew this son has brought his huge dishonor and shame on his family by demanding this. What a horrendous thing for him to do. Terrible. Anyway, you could do something about this. The normal thing you did about this was you brought back honor by discipline. So this child, this young son, should have been beaten. To uphold the honor of society, he should have been beaten viciously by his... But well, you get a servant to do it probably. But the father refuses. So what else do you do? Well, the other thing you do is when you have a break of a relationship like this, you bring in a mediator. It happens all over the world. You bring in a mediator. If I have a big bust-up with Peter over there so that we don't talk to each other, we have nothing to do with each other, then somebody else, like Andy, who knows Peter and knows me, brings us together, talks to him, talks to me, brings us together eventually. So there was a real chance. Yes, the whole thing could be solved by mediation between this younger son and his father. And who was the mediator? There was only one person who could be the mediator, the older son. And he refuses. He doesn't offer to be a mediator. He clears off. He's not around. And in doing so, he also brings huge insult on his family and on the family name. It was his duty to be the mediator, to bring this family together. And he totally says no. So both sons have broken relationship completely with their father. And what does this mean for the father? What does it mean for the family? It means, well, they're no longer regarded as with status. The father, he no longer gets invited to the meetings where the elders of the village meet. Instead of when people are meeting him, sort of bowing and respecting him, now they're laughing behind there. Look at him, look what he's done, look at their family. Just total dishonor and shame on this poor family and this poor father. Anyway, eventually they sort out this. They have to sell property. They have to sell land. All the village knows about it. They have to sell stuff because they had to get together a huge amount of money for this younger son. And eventually he clears off. And he clears off and he goes to a far country. Wonder how far away that was. Don't know. But he goes to a far country. And he spends his money. He lives a riotous life. He spends his money quickly on all sorts of things, good and bad, no doubt. He has a whale of a time, and he has loads of friends, and he has parties every night, and he has you can imagine. And after a year or two, that money begins to run out. That money runs out, so what's he going to do? And the friends that he had don't seem to want to be friends anymore. And then when the money gets down, what does he start? He finds that there's a famine in the country. A famine in the country. So not only does he run out of money, but he can't buy any food because there isn't any food there. He hasn't got the money for it anyway. It gets worse and worse and worse. And he gets to the stage where he has to, he's never done this before, he's got to go and beg for a job. He's got to go and find someone he knows and beg for a job. And he begs for a job with this man, and this man doesn't want to hire him at all. He's got no job for him. It's a famine situation. But in those situations, of course, you don't say no to anybody. You never say no to anybody, because that's bad manners. You don't say no to anybody in that sort of culture. And so the guy says to him, okay, come back tomorrow, I'll think about it. And then he thinks, what am I going to do? I don't want to give this guy a job. I know what I'll do. He's an Israeli boy, and Israelis don't like pigs. I know, I'll ask him to go and look after my pigs, because he will never, ever accept that sort of job. Not a chance. And so the next day he says, I've got a job for you. You can go look after my pigs. And to his astonishment, his younger son says, okay, I'll do that. Oh, no. I mean, that's the last thing that guy wanted. And we find he goes and looks after. You don't look after pigs in a famine situation. Pigs become wild animals in a famine situation. You get them far away from pigs as possible. It was no job at all. Anyway, there he is. And he was so hungry. He would have had anything, even what the pigs had. And as he's sitting there, very, very, very hungry, in rags, with nothing at all, he begins to think about, well, he's got loads of time to think about everything, isn't he? He thinks about home. And he suddenly thinks, the hired men in my village who sometimes work for my dad, they get lunch. They get lunch. Wouldn't that be nice? What about lunch? Wouldn't lunch be great? Now, you notice he's not thinking about any relationship with his dad. These hired men never saw the family at all. He's thinking about his stomach. That's what he's thinking about. He wants lunch. He wants food in his stomach. But after a while, he thinks, okay, maybe I will go home and maybe he's not thinking very straight at all at the moment, but because he's so hungry and he's so starving. But maybe they have food and I want that food. Maybe I can join them. But he doesn't think at all about his relationship with his dad or anything like that at all. That's beyond. That's gone. That's gone. He's never has thoughts for that. Okay. So eventually he starts to go home. And he starts to go home, and it's very slow, and he hasn't got any shoes by now, and it's very, very slow, and he's starving, hungry, and as he goes, he thinks to himself, what's going to happen? He says, when I get to the edge of the village, he says, when I get to the edge of the village, somebody's going to see me, and somebody's going to run out and recognize me and see who I am, and begin to make fun of me. And then other people are going to gather, and they're going to make fun of me, and they're going to push me, and they're going to laugh at me, and they're going to trip me up. And they're going to see that I'm in a terrible state, and they're going to humiliate me, and they're going to make my life an absolute misery, because that's what kids do. And then older people are going to come, and they're going to laugh, and I'm going to have a horrendous time as I go into the village, because people are going to humiliate me and make life an absolute misery for me. And so in a sense, yes, I want to get back to the village because hopefully I can eat something, but I don't want to get back to the village because it's going to be such a horrendous ordeal. And he starts that. Meanwhile, his father, back at home, has become a bit of a recluse because there's no point in going out, really. Because, you know, whenever he goes out, people look at him and laugh. So what does he do? Well, he spends a lot of time on the roof of the house, because the flat roofs, of course, in those days. So he spends a lot of time on the flat roofs there, thinking about, because he loves his boys. And he knows that his younger son went off somewhere in that direction. And he knows his older son, well, he never sees his older son, but he's around here somewhere. Maybe he's off in I don't know, but he's up there thinking about his boys. He loves his boys. And then one day he's up on the roof, and he sees in the far distance a movement. And as he gets a bit nearer, he sees the way that, and he thinks, I think that's my son. I think that's my son. And immediately, he's down the steps, and he's out, and he goes into the courtyard, and he begins to run. Now, this guy, all right, this guy has never run anywhere for 30 years. Yeah, he has never run anywhere for 30 years. So he runs for about 50 meters, and he's puffing, and he's blowing, and he can't get on. And, talk about couch to 50k. This guy needed couch to 50 meters. This guy did. I mean, he was, and he collapses, and he gets his breath back, and people come around him and look at it. What are you doing? What are you doing? And then he gets his breath back, and he runs on another 50 meters, and he collapses. And of course, to run in those days, he's used to wearing long robes, yes? Now, to run, you've got to lift your robes, right? You've got to lift your robes up above your knees. How horrific is that? How humiliating to show your ankles. Could you just understand the culture here? To show your ankles and to show your legs. Anybody around would say, look what he's doing. Look what he's doing. And they would laugh at him. And he ran on a few meters, and then eventually some of the servants from home rushed up and said, "Master, what are you doing? Where are you going? Master, you're going to have a heart attack." And he goes on, "I must go, I must go." And the crowd is falling. All the young people in the village and more people are looking at this guy who's making an absolute fool of himself and humiliating himself incredibly as he runs across out of the village. And the younger son is coming in, and he looks up and he sees a sort of a sandstorm ahead of him. And he looks and he sees a sandstorm, and it's coming towards him. And as he looks at it, and there are lots of people, there must be 50, 60 people around it now, all laughing and joking and poking fun and really making. And in the middle of this, he notices it's his father, who is now getting incredibly dusty and sweaty and horrible. And the son stands there and watches this come towards him, and he thinks to himself, that's what I deserve. I deserve that. I deserve that humiliation and that making fun of and being a laughing stock and all that. I deserve all that. And my father is taking the whole lot of me. And he stands there in awe. And eventually the father gets to him and hugs him. And hugs him, puts his arm around him. And the father eventually gets his breath back, and he says to the servants who are there, and whoever's so worried, they don't quite know what the world's going on here. He says, "Get the best robe and put it on him." The best robe, that's the father's robe. That's the important robe. And put a ring on his finger. Now, that's not just any old silly ring looks nice. That is the family ring. That's the business ring. That's the ring that allows you to have authority in the family. It's like the family credit card. You know, it's that. It allows you to do business. And he says also, put shoes on his feet. In other words, I'm not bringing this guy back to be a hired man. I'm not even bringing this guy back to be a slave. Because slaves don't wear shoes, eh? Put shoes on his feet, he says. And then go and fill that calf that we've been fattening up. Because we are going to have a party. Well, he didn't, so he says that. Exactly, he didn't have the breath, I shouldn't think. But anyway, we're going to have a party. And they turn and they go back to the village. And that son has been just overwhelmed. He made a little speech up about being a hired man, but he never thought he'd see his father anyway to say it, but he didn't. But he just realizes that being a hired man had nothing to do with building the relationship. He didn't understand that there was a relationship broken that had to be rebuilt here. He didn't understand. So they went back. And that afternoon, boy, that family, they were busy, particularly the servants. Wow, all the invitations had to go out because this was a big party for the whole village. And they had to get this calf, and they had to kill it, and they had to strip it, and they had to put it on a spit, and they had to light a big fire under it. And they had a party. Just picture the scene, this courtyard. One side of the courtyard is where the men met, you know, and it was sort of, it would have been a sort of horseshoe shaped, and the father sat at the front, and then the most important men of the village next to him, and the less important men as you go back, right? And then next door, in the next door room, there would be the women, did the same, and the important women and the less important women, all right? And then across the other side of the courtyard would be the kitchen area, and that's where the servants were so busy. And in the middle there would be a big fire and a spit, and this whole calf, big calf, was turning on this spit hours and hours, and the servants were preparing the vegetables and all that sort of stuff. And it was amazing. And there would be a music group there playing. And they'd be playing away at their, Israeli music. And everybody would be having a really good time. Now, come back to to where the father was. The father was sitting here at the head of the table. And on his right side, of course, is where the guest of honor is. And who's the guest of honor? The younger son is the guest of honor. What amazing. And then around the other side there would have been a space that was empty. And that's where the eldest son ought to have been sitting, but he was away. That wasn't particularly a problem, because he was always away. He was never around anyway, so they didn't know where he was. He didn't know the party was on. Fair enough, he was away. Okay, and the party got on. And then the message went out that somebody in the village had seen the elder son coming back, and he was. And okay, great, he's coming back. That's really good. He can come back and join in the party. But one of the servants goes out. Servant's household goes out and meets him on the edge of the village and tells him what's happened. Tells him his younger brother has come home. Tells him they're having a party. Told him we've killed the calf. And we're having a great time. And it's wonderful. And this older son is angry. And he comes up but he won't come in. He won't come in. He refuses to come in. And for the second time that day, that father does the most amazing thing in the world. For the second time that day, that father does astounding. He gets up from his place. Now, I tell you, you do not leave guests in that situation. If you are the host, you do not leave the table. That brings insult on your guests and humiliation on you. You do not leave the table. And he gets up and he moves around past the guests to go out. And the people around the table suddenly stop talking. What's happening? And then the people next door stop talking. And the servants stop bringing the food in. And they were constantly bringing food all the time. They stop. And the people who are playing the instruments, that fades away. And there's silence descends. What in the world is this father doing? Why is he leaving his... And he goes out across the courtyard and out of the courtyard, and he meets his eldest son. And what does he do? Does he tell him off? No, he doesn't. He pleads with his son. In that context, in that culture, you don't do that. He pleads with his son, and he begs his son to come in. And the son just shouts at him. The son shouts at him. He doesn't call him father or master or sir. He doesn't use any word of respect at all to his father. He just shouts at his son, his father. And after he's said his bit, he turns round and he storms away. And the father has to turn round and go back in. And we don't know what happened then. That's the end of the story. That's the end of the story. The main question is, of course, which son are you like? I'm like the elder son. I never openly and violently rebelled against God. God was always there, and I took a bit of notice of him occasionally, but But maybe you're like the younger son. Maybe you've had a period in your life where you've really rebelled against God, where you've said, God, get out of the way, I'm not interested. But it doesn't really matter which sort of son you are, because both sons needed to be totally overwhelmed by the love of God for them. That's what they needed. Totally overwhelmed by the love of God for them. And that's what being part of the family of the church is. Whether we're talking about the family of the church globally or we're talking about the family of the church here. We need to be people who have been constantly overwhelmed by the love of... Now, you may think that you've partly argued yourself into the kingdom or argued yourself out of the kingdom, and you've thought about this and you've read various books and you've thought... But actually, that's not the most important bit. You can't really work it out up here. It's a heart thing. You need to be overwhelmed by the love of, and you need to go on being overwhelmed, not just once. He said, go on being overwhelmed by the love of God for you. And that's most easily demonstrated, fully demonstrated in the cross, of course, where God took total humiliation upon himself. He took upon himself all that you deserved. Let's stop. Let's pause. Let's pray. Let's just think about that for a moment. Think about the fact that God has done so much. Father God has done so much for us to bring us into this family, to bring us into a family of relation.